Generative AI is here, and it has changed the rules of the game. Experts like Seth Godin and Robert McKee have been very clear. The authors who are going to make it in this business are those who are writing truly amazing, knock your socks off innovative stories. The bar is that high. AI will replace mediocre writers. But at some point, everybody is mediocre. So what do? You educate yourself. And the good news is that there's still time, but you've got to start leveling up right away. I'm Valerie Francis, and I've got a series of webinars to help you do just that. My specialty is helping authors like you put theory into practice. Understanding the tools of our trade and being able to apply them with precision is no longer an option. It's an absolute necessity. So go to valeriefrancis.ca/webinars for more information and sign up for the notifications. You can't afford not to.
If you want to write stories your readers will love, there are 3 things you need to do. Understand storytelling principles, see how other writers have applied those principles, and then use them in your own work. Here on the Story Nerd podcast, our goal is to demystify story theory. So we'll help you with the first 2 steps so that you can get started with the third. I'm Melanie Hill, writer, editor and poet, and I have a passion for spy stories, fairy tales, and master detective novels.
And I'm Valerie Francis. I'm a writer and literary editor, and I focus on stories by, for, and about women.
And on today's episode, Valerie pitched Big so that we can study character development. This 1988 film was directed by Penny Marshall from an original screenplay by Gary Ross and Anne Spielberg. Of course, there will be spoilers because we can't talk about the movie without talking about the movie, and we'd love it if you could give our show a rating and review. For Apple Podcast listeners, you can do it right from your phone. Simply go to the show's landing page and scroll to the bottom. It's that simple. All right, Valerie, this is an oldie but a goodie, so I'm hoping there's a lot in here in terms of character development. How did you go?
Well, you may have noticed this season that my movie choices have been lighter fare. I had chosen more dramatic films initially with richer characters, with more layers and all that good stuff. But Melanie, after we did Manchester by the Sea last season, man, I could not take any more serious films. I was bummed out for so long after Manchester by the Sea. I couldn't take it. So I overcompensated.
I'm worried because next week we've got one that's a bit heavy. So
I know. But listen, it's okay because we all need some lighter fare movies once in a while. And they still have characters that are different at the end than they were at the beginning. So all is not lost here. We are not all writing some big serious literary tome after all. And we don't have to write that kind of story in order to have a character with an arc. So that's my story and I'm sticking to it. So with Big, I think we have an opportunity to see how a character is handled in a comedy. So far this season, I've been focusing on the idea that character is revealed through action under pressure. This is just one aspect of theory as it relates to character, but I've stuck to it on purpose because this is how I study. I take one aspect of theory, something that I want to know more about, and I view a whole bunch of movies and I read a few different novels and I examine them through that one lens only. And yes, this is one idea, but it's sort of like the gateway into understanding character. The under pressure part is called the crisis moment of the scene. So what happens is that at the beginning of a scene, the character has an intention or a goal or something that they want to accomplish. And they have a plan for making it happen. But the plan either doesn't work out at all or doesn't work out as expected. Something that the character hadn't anticipated happens, and this knocks her off course. This unanticipated or unexpected event is called a turning point. Now, the turning point is something that throws the character into a crisis. And by crisis, I mean a dilemma. They don't know what to do. They have a choice between this or that, but they honestly do not know what to do in the face of this unexpected happening. And this is the pressure point that I'm talking about. The character does not immediately know what to do, but she has to do something, because if she doesn't do anything, your story is just going to stall right there. The action that the character takes when under this pressure is going to reveal who she truly is. It also just happens to be the climax of the scene. So, if we do not have a really solid understanding of who our protagonist is, we're not going to know what she would do when she's under pressure. So, if we think about our close friends and our family in real life, we know exactly how they would react under any given pressure. Well, we as writers have to know our protagonist as well as we know our best friend. But most writers don't, and this leads to all kinds of story problems. I don't know if I've seen them all yet, but I've seen a fair few. When we don't know how the character would react to a situation, here's what happens. As writers, we either avoid putting the protagonist into hot water in the first place, or we add more characters or more plot lines. Now, if you catch yourself doing any of these things, it is a flag. It means that you don't know your protagonist well enough. Let me give you an example. You might know that your character, let's call her Mary, is a woman who likes to be in control of a situation. And she usually is. She's in charge, maybe not officially, but unofficially or informally. And the people in her group tend to defer to her, and so she gets her own way. As a result, she's generally a pleasant person. Then someone new joins the group. Let's call her Jane. Jane has no desire to be the boss of the group, but she does want to be in control of herself. So when Mary tries to tell her what to do, Jane speaks up for herself. Mary isn't used to people resisting her authority, so how she responds to it will reveal who she is. Now, she's got lots of options, and you, as the writer, as the creator of this character in this world, can go in any direction you want to go in, that your character needs to go in. So here's just a couple of options that I brainstormed. Mary could respect Jane's wishes. She could talk behind Jane's back. She could have an overt argument with Jane. She could wither in the face of Jane's independence. She could listen to Jane's concerns and learn and grow. She could sabotage Jane in a passive-aggressive way. And the list goes on and on and on. That's just a couple I came up with quickly. Most writers don't give a lot of thought to a character's reaction, but that's a mistake. A great exercise, and I can hear people groaning before I even have this out of my mouth, but just stay with me here, okay? A great exercise is to think up scenarios that may or may not have anything to do with your story, and then think about how your main character would react to that situation and why she would react that way. You could choose a story from the news and write down your character's reaction to it. Write it down in first person as though the main character was writing her diary entry. I know this sounds like a lot of work, which is why I can hear people groaning. But trust me, it is worth it. Like, it is worth every single minute. Your character will be revealed to the reader through her action under pressure. And that means that you have to really know who the character is. And then you have to figure out ways to reveal it. Now, here's something else to think about. Your reader is expecting your character to be revealed in those points of pressure. So if nothing is revealed about your character, your reader might not be able to articulate what's going wrong in your story, but it'll feel funny to them. And they're just going to lose interest. So it's something the reader is looking for from you. Now, we can see this in action easier with stories like The Godfather, right? Michael Corleone is a deep character with lots of layers. Mario Puzo had to really know who Michael is so that he could reveal him to us. When Michael is in Sicily and he finds out his family has been attacked, he has the choice to return to New York, to stay in Sicily, or maybe even to go somewhere else and try to hide. The reader knows him as a war hero, as a peace loving man trying to live an honest life. But Puzo knew that deep down, Michael was even more ruthless than his father. Now, this means that the only possible action for Michael to take is to go back to New York. But we're not all writing gangster novels. We're not all writing characters who are that deep, and that is cool because we don't always want characters that are that deep. Sometimes we just want a nice story, just something to escape into. However, that doesn't mean we're off the hook. This is really important. We still have to know who our characters are, and we still have to convey that to our readers. So I thought Big offered a really good opportunity for us to look at how writers approach a character like Joshua, who doesn't have a whole bunch of layers, who operates sort of more at the surface level. Now, I hope that doesn't sound like an insult. It's not meant to be. I hope you know where I'm going with that. Alrighty, so let's look at a few scenes in Big to see how all this works out. Now, first off, I should mention that Big is a worldview maturation story. Now, maturation stories are extremely popular as primary genres. They are not just for kidlit or YA. Brooklyn, for example, is a maturation story. It's also super popular as a secondary genre. So, knowing how characters work in these kinds of stories is going to help you. Now, obviously, Joshua Baskin doesn't have the same kind of depth of character as Michael Corleone, but the writer still had to establish that he's immature at the beginning and mature at the end. There has to be some kind of growth. His view or opinion of his world has to shift in some way. So, in the first few scenes, it's clear that Joshua is the follower and Billy is the leader. Joshua is the quieter of the two, and he's shy. These characteristics are established through Joshua's actions. For example, he's busy looking at the baseball cards, got it, need it, got it, need it. And Billy is far more interested in looking at the girls. So Joshua's character is revealed here, but he's not under any particular pressure here. There's nothing serious happening yet. It's more establishing who he is. The scenes do have turning points, and Joshua does have moments where he needs to make choices, but the pressure's pretty low. His first real pressure point comes when he wakes up the morning after the carnival, and he realizes that his wish has come true. So what does he do? He hides from his mother and tries to fix the problem himself. He's not someone who wants to draw any undue attention to himself. We saw that already through his interaction with Cynthia. Billy, on the other hand, goes out of his way to make his presence known. When Joshua is not able to resolve the issue himself, he turns to his mother, naturally. And when that doesn't work, he turns to Billy. Billy is the guy with the plan. He's more mature than Joshua. For example, he's more focused on girls. He takes the lead on finding Joshua a job. It's even Billy who tells Joshua that he's being gross when, at the restaurant in New York, Joshua drops the cherry out of his mouth. Now, as we go through the middle of the story, Joshua is still very much a kid in an adult's body. He does go through some rites of passage. He gets a job promotion, he has sex for the first time, and he has his first girlfriend. While these are all external indicators of maturity, he hasn't actually matured much at all. There's tons of laughs in this section, though. It is a comedy, but there's not a whole lot of character development. For that, we have to fast forward all the way to the end of the middle build. This is the scene where the list of carnivals arrives. Billy keeps trying to contact Joshua, but Joshua blows him off because he's been given the responsibility of developing an entire product line, and he's in way over his head. He knows whether toys are fun to play with, but he doesn't know anything about writing business plans or marketing strategies. So Billy eventually then has to go to Joshua's office and he gets blown off again. But this time they have an argument. What's interesting here is that even though Joshua is in a 30-year-old body and he has more external life experience now, Billy is still the more mature character. He's been more mature the entire time and never more so than right now. Remember that Billy represents Joshua's childhood. Each major character in a story exists to bring out an aspect of the protagonist's character. I'm going to talk more about that next season, so hang on. But for right now, it's enough to know that Joshua's childhood is calling to him in the form of Billy, and he is rejecting it. He's not pushing Billy away because he hates Billy. He's pushing Billy away because he's afraid. He's in over his head. He doesn't know how to do this new job, and he's sort of freaking out a bit. What then does this scene reveal about Joshua? Well, it tells us that even though he's been pretending to be an adult, he's still very much a scared little kid. This also happens to be Joshua's all is lost moment. And so it's followed by his epiphany, which is that he's not ready to be an adult. The decision to go back to being a child, or at least to try to go back to being a child, is the most mature decision Joshua makes in the entire film. And of course, to do it, he literally runs away from Susan and his adult life. Whereas Billy is a representative of his childhood, Susan is a representative of his adulthood. So, what can we learn about character development from a protagonist like Joshua Baskin? And keep in mind, this is a comedy. Well, there's really only one shifting point, and that comes at the end of the second act, if we're thinking of a 3-act structure. And it's the epiphany, which follows the all is lost moment. And if you'll notice, in Big, this epiphany takes up quite a bit of screen time. What that means then is that if you're writing this type of character with only one shifting point, you've got to really drive that moment home. That scene is going to be longer. It might even be spread over a few scenes. You want to make sure you spend time on it in your story so that it has the right amount of oomph and so that it makes sense to your readers. All righty. I hope that's helpful. Melanie, how did you do with your study of world building this week?
Oh, well, I think it very much complements what you were saying there in terms of character development. So we'll have a go, because most of this movie is set right in the primary world, so the world that's most familiar to us. And it's interesting to look at what it's filled with and how particular the elements are in terms of character and things that each scene is filled with. All right, so this week I want to spend some time looking at the world building theory from Janet Burroway's book, Writing Fiction. And I also want to expand on the idea of the primary world and probably less so on the idea of a secondary world. Now, the section of Burroway's book that I'm referring to is on pages 101 to 123. And she asked some questions. So I'm going to ask those questions and sort of answer them and give a bit of an explanation. So let's start by looking at the opening scenes. So from Burroway's book, she says, quote, setting must do more than one thing at a time. It has to reveal emotion to illuminate the character and suggest the story's symbolic underpinning, end quote. So the opening scenes of Big, I think, really illuminate character and set up the thematic elements of this story. We see Josh's world via his bedroom, his home life, school, his friends, particularly Billy. And so what does this tell us? Well, he's a fairly normal kid with a normal life by Western standards. Now, the benefit of this fairly normal life is that the target audience has experienced a similar childhood or is experiencing a similar childhood. So it's worth highlighting that Josh's ordinary world, so his day-to-day life, is set, like I said before, in the primary world. So this is a world also that the audience lives in. Now, Josh's primary world doesn't need that explanation because it is so common. But the writers were very selective about what aspects of Josh's life they presented in his ordinary world. And every scene in the beginning of the story is actually referenced in the rest of the story. And it is also particularly mirrored in the end, which is interesting. So it really bookends. And, Valerie's talked about that previously on the podcast as well. Now, Josh's world is so simple and uncomplicated that when he confronts his first setback, which is really sort of being short, so being excluded from the fairground ride, it's a massive problem compared to the other things in his everyday life. So the fairground is an interesting addition to Josh's primary world because the fairground and the Zoltan machine are magical elements in what is otherwise a standard setting for the story. Now, we can suspend our disbelief of the magical elements because the writer has tapped into a universal longing that most of us would have experienced, and that is a child wanting to be bigger or older than what they are because they think that the life of an adult or the life of an older person is much easier or better. Now, and this is a result, right, of the child not obtaining something that they really want because of their age or their size. And it's a really clever use of universal experiences, I think, to help build that primary world. Now, the world here at the beginning has started to support the story's theme, which I've pinned down or I've written up as wanting to grow up before you're ready. So the setting and the problem that Josh faces illuminates his character, and Valerie's already covered that. And I think it's a really complimentary study that she's done in looking at it from a setting and a world building point of view. Now, one of the other questions that Burroway asks is, what does the place evoke for the reader? Does it evoke danger, freedom, comfort? And how does this change over the course of the story? So if we think about Josh's predicament when he wakes up as a 30-year-old, we know that Josh has not experienced the world of New York or the world of an adult. So he's thrust out of his comfortable and loving home into a world that's new to him and in a physical form that changes the way the world sees him. So he is the same person, but in a different body. And there's a comfort in the known world of the family and the home and the school because they're familiar. And then there's a real discomfort in the unfamiliar world of the adult in New York City. And again, though, all of this story is set in the primary world, even if it isn't Josh's primary world. So there's a real split between the two. Josh's primary world is his home, but the primary world of the audience is bigger in terms of the global setting of the story. So it's a really interesting study of how the writers have set this up. And it's going, if you follow Heroic Journey or A Hero with 1,000 Faces, this is really going from the ordinary world into the extraordinary world. I'll leave that for another day. So what this means for the world building is that the world can remain the same, but to keep the magic, Josh still has to act as we'd expect a 12-year-old to act. So as he works out how to exist in New York as an adult, his actions remain true to those of a 12-year-old. So, for example, he is scared by the unfamiliar people that he meets, the rundown state of his hotel room, the gunshots, the yelling. And he also believes that any amount of money that is larger than pocket money is massive. Now, what he does then is when he does get paid is he fills his space with the type of things a 12-year-old would prioritize. So we see after the first payday, we see pizza, string in a can, the flashing glasses. So it's really important to note that Josh fills his unfamiliar world with what is familiar to him. And then when he gets the job as the vice president of product development, he buys his own apartment and he fills it with toys. He fills it with soft drink vending machines, a trampoline, a bunk bed, and so on. And this is consistent with what we would expect a 12-year-old to do. Now, it's the contrast then between Josh's behaviour and the other adults that are important to the world building. The adults in the corporate world speak about toys in terms of demographics, sampling, testing, and revenue, whereas Josh plays with the toys and talks about the fun. Like we saw in the movie Can You Ever Forgive Me and in Ray and Bridget Jones, we only see specific settings in Josh's New York. Now, this is primarily the places where Josh sleeps or plays, his work environment, and the personal spaces of his workmates. So each scene is very specific, and what and who it's filled with is also very specific. Now, Burraway's question about what feeling a space evokes is really prompting you to look at the component parts of your fictional world. When you draw attention to where the characters act and what the background is filled with, or what time of day something happens, or the season, then what you are doing is building a world in the mind of a reader, but in a way that limits or enables the reader to make sense of your character's actions. Now, she also asks, how does place change over the course of the movie? Well, in Big, place doesn't change, but it's Josh's behaviour in the world of toy development that does change a little bit. And while he remains childlike to some degree, he does change. His change is marked in two ways. And the first is by what he wears. So Josh starts wearing suits after he spends time with Susan. And secondly, he marks change in how he values or prioritizes his relationships, and in particular, his relationships with Susan and also with Billy. Now, both these relationships sit at the two extremes in Josh's world. Susan is on the 30-year-old scale, while Billy is on the 12-year-old side. Now, Josh's move towards one and away from the other shows how Josh is adapting to life as an adult. But by selecting these characters and placing Josh in the middle of them, it perfectly illustrates Josh's dilemma. Does he go back to being a child and enjoy the experience of his teenage years, or does he accept this loss and continue on as an adult? So if I go back again to Burraway's question about how does the place change, and the answer is it doesn't, then what we do see is how the other characters and what they symbolise start to support the protagonist's story arc. Now, I also noticed that over the course of the story, Josh's office becomes more adult and he spends more time in Susan's apartment when they're working. So again, the specific details of the scene support the idea that Josh is stepping away from being a child. Now, while there are some great examples of how the world supports the narrative in Big, there are also some things that weren't so good that I noticed. Now, I think that there is a logic problem with the world building. Now, I picked up on this because, I'm an adult watching this movie. Now, a child may not notice the problem or the problems with the idea of a kidnapped Josh, which is set up and referenced throughout the story. So the reason that Josh and Billy go to New York is because there's no logical explanation as to why 12-year-old Josh has become 30-year-old Josh. We see Billy sneaking past the police investigation. We see Josh calling his mother, writing to his parents, and then there's Josh's missing persons photo on the milk carton. Now, the purpose of these parts of the story is to remind us of Josh's object of desire, which is to return home as his 12-year-old self. But for me, these raised problems such as, why isn't Billy questioned by the police? Why aren't the phone calls and the letters mechanisms to help find Josh? And what happens when Josh returns home after being missing for weeks? Now, I know the focus of this story isn't about Josh going missing. However, as part of my study of world building, these plot problems raised the following questions. How complete do you want your world to be, and how much scope do you have to do this? And also, how smooth do the edges between the plot and the world building have to be? Now, I think the answer will depend upon how close to the primary world your story is, who the audience is, how much time you have, and also the medium you're using to tell the story. In Big, the clunkiness is a result of the story being set in the primary world and the time limitation of the movie format. In the primary world, we know a child's disappearance and continual contact from the kidnappers would trigger and sustain a major investigation. I think kids probably know this too, but I'll say for the sake of argument that this is an adult's experience of the world. So to me, this is incomplete plot and world building development. So the movie medium does place a limitation on writers and directors about what to include and what not to include. And there are real clear places for me where Big could be tighter. There's the scene where Susan and Paul try to work out who Josh is and where he came from. But it only serves the story when Josh tries to explain to Susan that he's really 12 years old. And it's kind of a bit incomplete there anyway. If you were writing this story, then you may be able to develop the kidnapping and Paul's search to find out who Josh is as part of the story within the 20 to 55,000 word recommendation for a middle grade book. Now, I raise these points because they highlight some of the decision making you have to do when building your fictional world. So in summary, the world building in Big, I think, benefits from the following. The target audience's universal experience of a Western childhood is used to great effect. So that universal experience is that children want to grow up quickly. Now, the primary world of corporate toy makers remains consistent, and it's Josh's behaviour and his worldview that are in conflict with this world. And also, Josh's world is filled with things and people that support his story arc. All right, Valerie, that's what I had for Big. What is the action step for this week?
Well, we don't let logic interfere with any of the 1980s movies. I mean, we just kind of go with it in the 80s. It was all that hairspray. Right. People were just whacked out.
Shoulder pads, big hair.
Yeah, the hairspray and the shoulder pads. Let's not even go in the direction of Susan actually being a pedophile, because that ruins all the fun.
I know.
It's like in Back to the Future, we don't really want to talk about Marty kissing his mother. We have to put that aside for our psychological well-being and our emotional well-being.
Yes.
All right. Oh my God. I wonder if Tom Hanks ever thought about that, or he just cashed his check and went home. All right. So I'm going to give you a writing exercise this week. I did mention one earlier, but here's another one just for fun. I want you to interview your protagonist, but interview them as though you are the therapist. Think about a conflict that your protagonist has to deal with in your novel, anyone at all. And then ask your protagonist to explain to you how it makes them feel. It's kind of a trippy exercise, but if you go with it and give it some time, I think you're going to like it. Now, if you don't even know where to begin with this exercise, I think that it's a pretty good indication that you don't know your main character well enough. However, if I asked you to do this exercise for someone like Michael Corleone or Walter White or Jimmy McGill or Tony Soprano, I bet you could do it. Or Nurse Jackie. That's because those writers took the time to develop complex characters, and they thought long and hard about how to reveal those characters to us slowly over the course of their stories. And you know what? That's what we've got to do too.
All right, that wraps it up for this week. Join us again next week when we discuss The Boy in the Striped Pajamas. And have your tissues ready. That's my warning. Sorry, Valerie. To support the show, please leave us a rating and review and tell your writer friends about us. For access to writing templates and worksheets and more than 70 hours of training, subscribe to Valerie's Inner Circle by visiting valeriefrancis.ca/inner circle and follow her on Twitter and Instagram at Valerie_Francis. And if you'd like to get my tips about books to help you read like a writer, visit me on Facebook and Instagram under Melanie Hill Author, or find out more about me at melaniehill.com.au. And remember, story theory doesn't have to be difficult. It's a tool to help you write more, not less. So take it one step at a time and have fun.